session of this 3-day workshop. The session we have lined up is overview, introduction to the background and context of the TBT Agreement, key terminology and concepts. The speaker for these sessions are Mr. Erik Wijkstrom and Mr. Mateo Ferrero. My colleague Arvind has already introduced Mr. Erik, but I would like to read a short bio for Mr. Mateo Ferrero. Mr. Mateo Ferrero is a counselor in the Trade and Environment Division of the World Trade Organization, where he works on matters at the intersection of trade and the environment, as well as on the technical barriers to trade. In this capacity, Mr. Ferrero regularly provides advice with respect to environment and sustainability policies having an impact on international trade. Mr. Ferrero has also worked in the area of WTO dispute settlement advising panel and the appellate body in their disposition of disputes in relation to various trade topics, including environmental measures, trade remedies, technical regulations, government support policies in the renewable energy sector, and export restriction. Mr. Ferrero has obtained law degree from the Universidad de los Andes from Colombia and a master degrees on international economic trade law from the University of Barcelona, Spain. Now I would like to request Mr. Erik and Mr. Mateo to begin with the session. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning everyone. You will notice that me and Mateo are quite mobile, so we'll be walking around. In this first session, we're going to start with a kind of icebreaker exercise to make sure that you will also intervene and discuss with us. And the idea with this is, I could ask colleagues to help with this, to distribute the pages that we ask for copies. There is this paper here. We're going to put a few on each table, for participants. You can put 2 or 3 of these on each table, and maybe for the participants, those who are sitting along the wall, if you have a place by the table, sit by a table, but it's up to you. There are 10 statements here in this one, and they go to some of the core issues with the TBT agreement, to some extent also the SBS agreement, which is a sister agreement in the WTO. On each page there are 2 affirmations. One is right, one is wrong, or one is better, the other one is not as good. So what we will do is ask you to go over these 10 statements. You have 10 minutes, 15 minutes perhaps, to look at them, and then we will discuss them one by one and see what you think, which are the correct ones. So the idea with this is to just begin to start thinking about the issues before we start explaining them and going into a little bit more detail. So with that, we will make sure there are 2 or 3 per table, or maybe more, or around, and then I'll give you now 10-15 minutes to look at this. Does everyone, all tables have it? The best is if you discuss among yourselves. What is the position about this table? So most of you are on number 4, or on number 3 or 4. So you can't take it too seriously. Just go by instinct. Which one you think is correct? Sometimes the right one is not so obvious. Have you finished? Okay, shall we start? Maybe I'll ask you, because you're sitting right in front.
Yeah.
If you want to read out the A and B number one, read that.
Number one, you are WTO members. The WTO came into being in January 1995 and currently has a considerable members representing 60% of our trade. So it has a budget of around 200 billion USD and a staff of 600 plus. Second statement is the WTO agreement covers almost 100% of the world trade and all its members have equal decision-making rights.
Which one is right?
Option B.
And why?
But most of the trade takes place as per the WTO norms, as per standards. The legal trade had considering WTO norms, SPC and TBT.
So here the argument is that B is correct, you're saying,
In my opinion.
in your opinion. Yeah.
Are there any other views? Good morning, everyone. Very nice to be here with you today. So the idea here is that we do a bit of a warm-up exercise, just to get us going. And as you may have seen when you went through this, it's not quite evident which of the two statements is better. So there is no right or wrong. The idea is simply to get a discussion going and to share views and to maybe go deeper into some of these issues. So our colleague here already shared his view with respect to statement one. Is there any view with respect to, is there any other view on that? Does somebody think that the correct statement is A?
So we have consensus in the room, the way the WTO works. What is the problem? You are correct. So what is the problem with A? Why is A wrong?
It's 60% global.
It's a lot more than that, right? It's perhaps even over 95%. Even more, perhaps.
Yeah. But otherwise, A, in terms of the budget, is about correct. So the WTO does have a budget of around $200 million, which means it's a rather small international organization in terms of budget. Other UN organizations, WTO is not UN, but other UN organizations have a much larger budget and a much larger staff. So the WTO has about 630 people working. In the Trade and Environment Division where we work, we are about 18, I think. Within the TBT team, we are around 8 or 9 people, so you have most of the TBT here with us with you today, including the chairperson. So we're quite a lean organization in that sense. About 55% of our staff are women, and 45% are men. So women are underrepresented, unfortunately, in this event. One thing about B that's also important to mention is that it says that all members have equal decision-making rights. Is that clear to everyone? Because the WTO works by consensus at whatever level, whether it's the ministerial council, at the ministerial level, or at the committee level, or even lower subgroups, any decision taken by the WTO has to go forward by consensus. Which means that the WTO in general is quite stuck today, because there's a lot of political discord, a lot of difficulties between countries, as you know, so it's quite difficult to come to a negotiated outcome when all members have to agree. We're quite fortunate at the committee level that we are able to advance on several issues. At that more technical level, sometimes the debate is a little bit more constructive, not always. Sometimes it's more constructive. But that's an important thing to keep in mind, that any decision taken at the WTO is taken at the level of consensus. But the budget provided to WTO is not that every member pays the same amount into the budget. You pay into the WTO's budget in relation, in proportion to your trade in the world. So that is that bigger countries will pay a much bigger proportion of the budget than the smaller ones, but each country has one vote. I say vote, although we never go to votes, so it's by consensus. Okay? Any thoughts on this? You may jump in any time. You have questions? Yes, good. Are there more microphones we could use? There's no
Hello, it's not a question, I have a doubt here. There are non-member countries as well. So when it says that 100% of world trade, WTO agreements cover almost 100% of world trade, then could you please elaborate as to how the non, because when we say 100%, it is assumed that all countries will be.
Yeah. We have one map in one of the presentations which shows the membership of the WTO across the globe. And the membership covers almost all countries in the world, but in any case, all the major countries of the world are covered, so all the main traders. By that I mean India, China, European Union, Japan, US, all those are covered by WTO rules because those are members of the WTO. That's why about 90, I don't remember exactly what the figure is, but it's 98.
Yeah, I think it's 98% or something around that.
98% of the value of global trade is covered by WTO rules, and that the members are, those countries are members of the WTO. Was that right? Did I clarify the question? You don't look convinced. Okay.
Maybe just one additional point on that, which is this nice map that you see at the bottom of the page. It wasn't like this in 1995 when the WTO was created. Since 1995, a number of countries have acceded to the organization and have therefore become members, including some that are particularly important for world trade matters. Like China, for instance, acceded only in 2001. Russia acceded in 2012, I believe. And now a number of countries, but of course a decreasing number, are in the process of acceding to the organization. And those are the ones that you see there with the color yellow.
I think it's not about membership, what is being talked about, but it is the coverage of the agreement. 100% of the trade. There is some sort of a problem with the way it is today. Maybe I think it needs to be looked more careful.
Thank you. This is
It's
yeah.
not about 100% of the.
Yeah.
I have a question.
100% value of trade.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is very good. Sorry to interrupt, but
It is coverage of the trade.
yeah, I think
Like
we need.
goods, services and.
Yeah, we need to put the word value in there. So it's good. Every time we do this, we make it a little bit better. Please do.
I just wanted to understand, as you said, it is a consensus always. So what do you mean by consensus? It is in between the committees or the members. Could you please elaborate on this? Thank you.
So consensus means, I mean, if you imagine, I don't know how many people we are in the room here, but say that we are 164. If we all have to agree on a text and a declaration, everyone in this room has to, or how should I put it, no one in this room can object. So if any one of you is unhappy with what is in the statement that comes out of this room, we make a declaration out of this room and objects to it, we don't have consensus. So each member of the WTO, each country has the ability to object if they so wish, and therefore creating a consensus, not getting consensus. Does that clarify it?
Is like consensus between the committees. Members, okay. Member country, non-member countries, we should have a consensus on a particular agreement or the points coming up for the TBT. But what about the committees? Like,
Yeah, but the committees, the councils, the working groups, they are made up of the members. So you are the committees. So like the TBT committee where Anwar chairs it, it is the membership that is there. So if India is not unhappy with a particular text that is being negotiated in that committee, they can block it. But it's not the body that counts, but those who make up the body. Okay.
Maybe one additional thought on that point, because if you look at the WTO agreements, what's interesting is that it actually speaks about the possibility of voting. And exactly as what Erik said, every country has one vote. which is different from the way it works in the World Bank and the IMF, in which voting rights depend on the way they they are shareholders of the organization. At the WTO, each country has one vote. However, the WTO's predecessor, which was the GATT, started in 1947, had this tradition of doing things by consensus. So what's interesting is that this tradition held, and despite the fact that in the WTO agreements there is this reference to voting, virtually all decisions are taken by consensus, even to this day. And this has pros and cons, of course. The pros, what are some of the pros? Well, that there is a lot more legitimacy when a decision is made, because that basically means that no member has formally opposed, which is what Erik has just explained. What are some of the cons? Clearly, and I mean, we see it in the newspaper almost every day. It is indeed more difficult to actually create new rules, to make decisions, because even one country opposing can completely block decision making. So maybe that additional thought, just by way of bringing a historical perspective. Any other views on statement 1, or should we go to statement 2? Great.
Statement 3, the person of between members, it can be a non-member to member also, member to non-member also. We take case from us analysis. Because non-member to non-member may be very, very less. It may be characteristic to have 100%.
Thank you so much. I mean, Erik and I enjoy doing these activities for many reasons. One of them certainly is the fact that this discussion from you helps us also tweak further these statements so that they are better and better every time. So should we go to maybe statement 2? Maybe I'll invite somebody from this table to read statement 2.
Trade liberations. The WTO's main objective is trade liberations to make trade between countries free, open, and transparent. In our view, it is
And could you read B as well?
B is while the WTO is essentially a forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements, it is not just about leveraging trade, its rules, it also support maintaining barriers, including bans.
In your view, which of the two is the better statement?
In my view, it is A, is a better statement. What is in my mind, the objective is the trade liberalizations and trade between countries free, open, and transparent.
So in your view, that prevails.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Are there any other views? I see 2 hands, maybe here and then there.
I support the option B, where it talks about forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements. And it is not just for liberalization, means liberalization is included. However, its rules support maintaining barriers and including bans as well. There are a lot of examples in place where there are barriers as well as bans based on scientific testing.
Thank you so much. Maybe would you like to supplement that?
I would also support B, because transparency already it will attain to when we talk about supporting and maintaining barriers, including bans, and it is a forum which is basically providing government a forum to negotiate trade agreements. So I would support B. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think statement 2 is a tricky one. It's almost like a cheeky one, because if I read statement A, I agree with so many things there. Indeed, the WTO is about making trade between countries free. It is also about making trade open, and indeed, it is about making trade more transparent. So far, so good. But in my view, and there is no right or wrong, but in my view, perhaps between the two, I will go with my colleagues here on the left that supported statement B, because I see one small problem with statement A, which is the word main objective. Many people, and particularly when the WTO is displayed on the media, there is this tendency to let's say, confine the WTO's objectives to trade liberalization. And I think maybe this is where statement B offers us a fuller picture of maybe what the WTO is about. So I would agree that indeed the WTO is about making trade free between countries, open and transparent, but the other parts mentioned in statement B are very important. And especially in this week, in which we're going to talk about technical barriers to trade, in which the issue of legitimate objectives and policy space and regulation is very important. Because indeed, as we will see, the WTO agreements, and in particular the TBT agreement, provides ample regulatory space for members to adopt some measures that may have an impact on trade, and some of those measures could even be banned. So we will go into that issue in a lot more detail, but I guess it was important to get the discussion going. I think I see one intervention here. Yes,
sir. I have a very nuanced approach between these two. Actually, as regards the aim, the main objective, apart from the liberalization, there is another aspect of the WTO basic tenet, was that it was based on to ensure the hassle-free trade across the globe. That based on non-discriminatory approach. There should not be any discrimination between the trading partners. That was missing in the first A. But at the same time, as regards the B, this B statement is also very tricky because under these non-tariff barriers also proliferate. So wholeheartedly you can't say that the A, I think I should support A also 100%, I also 100% B. There has to be a balanced view between A and B.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those observations. I think the colleague here was also bringing to the fore other important issues that are so central to the WTO agreements that maybe they should have been also on the statements. So thank you for that.
Yeah, very.
I would go by A because the reason is one of the main objectives. You could have added that, then it would have become complete. Why I would not go with B is that it talks about barriers. Actually, it talks about measures. It talks about measures which become barrier. Okay, there's no barrier you put in the WTO, but you actually put a measure which is taken on a scientific basis, or it comes out of a standard, and it emerges out of a standard, and then it becomes a barrier for many countries. There will be countries who do not have the capacity. That's a different thing. And it also talks about barrier, which WTO does not encourage. If I'm correct?
I think the whole idea with these two statements is a little bit to bring up this discussion. So, and if you look at the text in red below, it's really which is the better statement here. And for me, there could be bans that are justified. You could have a ban on the trade in endangered species under the CITES Convention for multilateral environmental agreements. That's something that is accepted by almost all members. It affects trade, and one of the objectives there is environmental protection. Or you could have a ban on the import of toys which have too much lead. I think you gave a good point here. Some measures will lead to bans in their application, and the point we're trying to make is that through application, this is allowed. Some people think that WTO is only about free trade. I want to get it across, it might be strange coming from someone at WTO. It is not. You have the right to implement measures which may go as far as banning trade, but make sure you have the right motivation and the right background. But that's what we're trying to say when we put saying that B may be a slightly better statement. There's also a problem with another word in A that we have tweaked a few times in similar discussions, and that I don't think WTO is really about making trade completely free. I mean, as it might sound strange, as a general objective, yes, but I think it's about making trade freer. You know, if you had the word to make trade between countries freer, then I think A has a much stronger case. So that I could stand behind. And then we had that in an earlier version, and people really struggled behind the two until we changed it to free, which makes A a little bit too categorical, a little bit too strong. So one has to always step back and think that, especially in the area of regulation and standards, some of these measures will result in restrictions on trade, and some may be very justified. Of course, then you have to implement it, as you say, as was said before by the gentleman, in a non-discriminatory manner. You have to notify it, it has to be transparent. You cannot create an unnecessary barrier to trade. You should use an international standard. All these things come on top. But in general, you do have the right to regulate. So that's why B, in my view, is a better statement.
Perfect. We move to statement 3 then. Who would like to read it? Maybe somebody from this table? Any volunteers here? No, this table has already participated. No, so here.
This is third one. A option is international trade is an engine for economic growth and poverty reduction. It can contribute to the promotion of sustainable development. And the B option is international trade leads to economic growth, poverty reduction and sustainable development. So, in my view, I will support both are similar. There is just a framing of words. Only the first one is supporting that it can contribute to the promotion of sustainable development, and B directly says that international trade leads to the economic growth, poverty reduction and sustainable development. So all together hand in hand. So in my view, the number 1 goes to B and the number 2 is A.
So you're choosing B?
Yes.
B?
Yes.
Yeah. But the way are you a lawyer?
No.
You should become one, because you did that very nicely. But the way you said it, it sounded like you were going towards A, but then you chose B.
No, because it can contribute, can is something which is a possibility.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Thank
so
you.
you're going for B. Any other ideas in the room? A.
Why I think A? Because it leads to the realization that sometimes trade may not always lead to sustainable development. There is an open-ended statement there. You have examples where it has not led to sustainable development.
So you're saying A because I think what you're saying, tell me if I'm wrong, that B couldn't be correct because sometimes it doesn't lead to sustainable development. So by default, you go back to A. Any other ideas? Anwar, you're struggling with this text. What do you think?
I'm not struggling, it just echoes the discussion that we have in the rooms where different countries have different perspectives. We have the same text and people come from different lenses. So, for example, when you look at sustainable development, the whole idea that trade for sustainable development, the discussions on trade and sustainable development, when you look at them, inherently people do understand that trade may not be leading to sustainable development, hence we need to have a dialogue towards working to create this platform and work that trade has to lead to sustainable development. Otherwise, inherently trade perhaps was not leading to sustainable development, just echoing what he just said now. So, what the discussion in the room actually, I'm just trying to reflect on what happens in the WTO rooms.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this one? One second, because we don't hear.
Although I go by the TBT, I have gone by that. Holistically, it's true, in my perspective. but I have some elaboration on this poverty reduction and sustainable development issue WTO. Can you elaborate on this?
I think the colleague here is making a good point. Maybe should we also talk a little bit about economic growth and poverty reduction?
Not economic growth, is understood.
Okay.
How these rules applications.
Would you speak closer to the mic?
How these rules applications of the WTO lead separately to poverty reduction across the boundaries, and also it leads to sustainable development. Can you elaborate this on detailed examples?
Yeah, this is something we could have an economic seminar on for a full day, and we will not come to a conclusion of it. So, I mean, one thing that economists of all colors agree on is that you do have a correlation between more open trade, which leads to more competition, and economic growth. But poverty reduction, sustainable development, inequality, they're different things. So what I think A says that international trade, and I think the more important word there is and. So it's one engine for economic growth. One. But you need other engines. So it's one engine, and then the more important word is can contribute to the promotion, but maybe won't. So what I'm trying to say is B for me is too automatic. There is no automaticity between international trade and sustainable development. Government's role and the importance of putting sustainable development in the agenda and seeing how you can do the importance of seeing what you can do in terms of alleviating inequality within countries. They may not be trade policies, but they are also important, and one has to look into that. So countries can be completely open for trade, but have very unequal distribution of wealth within the country. And they may have no policies whatsoever to protect the environment. Is that good? Probably not.
No, in that sense, international trade is not an engine for what you have said, sir. In that context, international trade is not necessarily an engine for poverty reduction.
Yeah, not necessarily are the keywords, exactly. But it can be an engine for economic growth. And if you look at the history in terms of freer trade and correlate economic growth with freer trade competition, you have that growth. What I'm saying is that growth and the benefits from growth may not be evenly distributed. And that will cause problems. And it is, you see it all over the world, those problems are there. So I guess the main point I'm making is international trade is not the solution. You need always to have accompanying government policies, but it may not actually be the remit of WTO. If you don't have good education policies, if you don't have good health policies, countries will fall back, and that affects economic growth too. So for me, therefore, I think the main point to make here is that I think A is the better statement, because B is too automatic. It's too categorical. It's not a necessity. But this always creates debate. And there are always discussions on that. So I'm not insisting on the way. It's the way of looking at it.
I think maybe a colleague there had an intervention.
Even the trade deficit in the countries, we cannot take the statement B in a straightforward manner, because the countries which are having a much higher trade export in other countries, and like India and China, is a trade barrier. So we cannot say that international trade leads to economic growth as in a whole statement. So trade deficit needs to be taken into account also. So it cannot be taken as a whole. This B statement cannot be taken as a whole.
Good.
Okay, maybe we go to statement 4 then. Maybe, yeah, maybe over there there could be a volunteer to read statement 4.
So, statement 4 is balance. The WTO, TBT and SPS agreement strike a balance between members' right to regulate for legitimate objectives, example health, and the need to prevent measures from becoming unnecessary barriers to trade. Statement B is the TBT agreement safeguards members' right to impose regulations to achieve legitimate objectives even if such measures restrict trade.
Which of the two, in your view, is the better statement?
I think so, A1.
A. Why?
Because the TBTs and SPS regulates the measures and it gives the right to members countries to regulate their trade and protect their rights like health and SPS measures which give to protect their plants, animal health and other things. So I think.
Thank you. We will go once again in a very lawyerly way into like specific text in the statements, maybe just to go a bit deeper, but maybe just to see if there is any other reactions from the room. Does anyone think the better statement is B? Yes, over there at the back. Maybe if you could give the microphone. Thank you.
Good morning. I believe it's B because I think the WTO TBT and SPS agreements are not really designed to strike a balance, but rather to have a preference towards achieving legitimate objectives by the members' measures. And while members formulate the measures to achieve legitimate objectives, there should be a thrust towards making sure that they don't create unnecessary barriers to trade. So I think this architecture of the agreements is not to strike a balance, but to give a preference towards legitimate objectives. That's what I think it's B.
Thank you very much. It's funny because when I heard the first explanation from the colleague here on the left, I thought you were going to go for B, but then you opted for A, and I think I would agree with my colleague here on the right, if only because both of you were recognizing the importance of adopting measures to regulate for legitimate objectives. And I think our colleague here was mentioning, SPS objectives, the protection of health, etc. Where I think statement A potentially becomes a little problematic is this when it refers to this notion of striking a balance between the members' right to regulate and the need to prevent measures from becoming unnecessary obstacles, which I think was the point being made by my colleague here on the right. So, in my view, and this is not necessarily the correct view, but just personally, this notion that you need to strike a balance is not necessarily correct one, because in a way the WTO TBT agreement and the SPS agreement provide ample regulatory space to members to adopt measures to pursue legitimate objectives. Now, in the SPS agreement, those objectives are confined to sanitary and phytosanitary issues. In the TBT agreement, on the other hand, those objectives can be a bit broader, and we'll go into that in more detail in the next couple of days. But the key thing, in my view, is to really understand that regulatory space is granted by the WTO agreements, including the TBT agreement and the SPS agreement. So, in a sense, there is no need to strike a balance between that right to regulate and the need to avoid unnecessary obstacles. And basically,
just a point here, Mateo. While I take your point that there is no need to strike a balance, like what Sarthak is saying, it is legitimate objective. But the word, the sentence construction in the first one, if you read, while you talked about balancing the members' right, the second word, it is not between right to regulate and necessary trade barriers. Here it talks about unnecessary trade barriers. So should it be more the right to regulate and necessary trade barriers, or unnecessary? You can never justify unnecessary trade barriers. You can never balance anything with unnecessary trade barriers. So inherently, when you look at TBT agreement, it talks about, it recognizes members have right to regulate and impose trade barriers. That should not become unnecessary. That's how it is. So when you talk about balance, I think the balance is more about necessary trade barriers and regulation.
Thank you, Anwar. I think there was a very important point, and we will go into it in more detail. Maybe 2 more reactions. First here.
I think one needs in the A, the word unnecessary, and in part B, legitimate. In that case, to take it together will make sense, because what is legitimate cannot be unnecessary. Now, the question therefore becomes, how do you define what is necessary? How do you define what is legitimate? That is the crux of the debate, and that's where I think we need to go.
Following from Preetham, I also want to add, science always evolves. And what you take as a legitimate measure and propose may not be a legitimate measure if you have to take it. So science evolves. I think, that's my view.
In a way, you have jumped ahead a little bit, because in the topic of good regulatory practices, which we will look at, which is not in the agreement, but which is part of members' experience, there is this point that science changes, technology moves on, international standards change, so what might have been a good regulation 10 years ago may now be something that needs to be revised and changed. So that's another very important point with the TBT and SPS agreements, is that these agreements are quite flexible in that sense.
Sir, I have a submission here. You have actually been in contrast. You have preferred to adopt the submission of the B. But the basic tenet of the TBT is to ensure that the technical requirements, even if it is a legitimate thing, should not become the unnecessary obstacles to B. That is the basic premise of the TBT, as I understand. So this principle B, what are the hypothesis B, runs contrary to that.
I actually tend to agree. You see, even we here, looking at this, and we've been working with this for many years, that's the point we want to get across. This is not easy stuff. So I have a preference for A. So, because for me, I'm talking now, he will hit me later, but TBT agreement and SPS is about balancing. So you will always, as a regulator, have to balance the objective, which is maybe environmental protection, public health, etc., against the consequence that it will have on trade. And there may be some of those that are unnecessary, and then you get into the question that Preetham raised here, that we need to get very much into the issue of what is a necessary barrier and what is an unnecessary barrier to trade. Because the legitimate objective is not going to be questioned. If you look at all the trade concerns, except in some cases, if you look at all the trade concerns in the TBT committee, our government will always say, my objective is protection of human health. My objective is protection of environment. And it's very difficult to challenge that objective, because what do you do? But if your measure is applied in a way that it is discriminatory, or that you go too far, we will see some examples, then you open yourself up to challenge on the application. Therefore, a bit contrary to what you said at the bottom, this is all a discussion, it's an issue of argumentation. I often think it is about balancing this objective against the actual application of the measure. But one can see it. So I would say in this one there's no real wrong or right.
Yeah, I agree, and there's no wrong and right. But regulation, and then it's a regulation, it's not a standard. It's a mandatory regulation. It's taken based on science. So you can restrict. To that extent, I go.
Thank you, my friend.
Any more? Yeah.
There's one here.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, after listening to all these views, actually I have also taken on A. I require one clarification from your side, like when we work at the TBT or SPS committee level, whether this particular statement A is not rightly used, making the balance and having the consensus.
I didn't quite catch the question. Maybe the deadline.
Yeah, if you see, it talks about agreement strikes a balance between the legitimate objective, and it also assures, I may say, that not to become the unnecessary barrier to trade. When at the committee level, when the consensus are built, so at that point of time, such balances are actual in practice.
Well, I mean, these types of questions, they arise at the level of each individual government when they are going to regulate to achieve a particular policy objective. At the committee level, when we talk about consensus, these are about decisions taken on recommendations or even decisions or principles in the committee. It's kind of at another level. That's how I would see it.
Yes, maybe one area in which in the committee this sort of discussion would arise is when one member is raising what we call a specific trade concern vis-a-vis another member. In other words, when one member is complaining about the regulation of another member. And we will go into a lot more detail into how this happens and the like, but maybe that's one area in which this discussion very much surfaces in the committee, and one member takes issue with the fact that a regulation is maybe creating an unnecessary obstacle, and the other member defends it by claiming that it is necessary. So maybe to go back to the point made, which was one of the key issues here in the context of TBT is assessing whether a technical regulation creates an unnecessary barrier to trade. And over the years in WTO jurisprudence, there has been ample debate as to how that analysis is conducted. So when we take a look at the cases, we will go step by step into the types of issues that an adjudicator or a policymaker would need to consider in deciding whether a regulation creates an unnecessary barrier.
Shall we move to the next one, which is precisely about legitimate objectives? But we'll answer.
This is regarding policy objective. Statement A says, several policy objectives may be legitimate and justify the adoption of a TBT measure. And statement B says, national security, prevention of deceptive practices, the protection of human health or safety, and protection of environment are the legitimate objectives that may justify the adoption of a TBT measure. I would go with option B because it gives a clarity on what are the legitimate objectives that comes under TBT measure, where the statement A says several policy objectives, which is very vague and broad.
What do others think? Do you all agree on B? There's a point at the end.
I think both A and B are equivalent in my mind because it was saying it B is not good enough, right? Because it gives you everything under the sun, more or less, to a large extent. It's my personal view because when you look at national security, health, I mean, these are all the issues which covers why anybody would put standards in. And I look to you to tell me, are there any standards ever that will not fall under the broad definition of B that is available?
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that.
Any other thoughts? So this is a bit of a trick question.
In the previous context, is protectionism of the domestic manufacturers that also have not been covered in the legitimacy in another term of legitimacy. Now here, the point B, whatever they have been taking these legitimate objectives have come. I'm thinking, wondering what to choose A or B. That legitimacy, if I choose B, then it will run contrary to my submission earlier that it will stop balance in the previous context. That's why I am really not very ambiguous in this.
So what's the big difference between A and B here? I mean, there is a significant difference. Yeah. You had a point? Use the microphone.
Point number A, that is legitimate justify the adoption of the TBT measures. Where here it is mentioned as a legitimate objective that may justify the adoption of a TBT measure.
That's a silly difference in formulation on our part. That was not intended to be the main. If you know, what I'm trying to get at is, if you look at A is an open. It's an open box, like you said. It gives the member the right to invoke any legitimate objective. While B, the key word here is the word the, or the legitimate. So basically B closes the TBT agreement to those that are listed there. But is the TBT agreement closed?
So I would tend to go more for A because the TBT agreement has a more open-ended concept of what legitimate objectives are, because the term used there is inter alia, and there are also certain other examples like geographical, climatic factors, technological problems, which are not mentioned here but listed in the TBT agreement. So to that extent, I would go with A.
Very good, yeah, exactly. Another comment. But while we move to that person.
I would supplement to the same. Like we can say like several policy objectives, including national security prevention, and it has a broader version. So I would also go with A.
Okay. So one of the big differences between the TBT and the SPS agreements is that the TBT is open. So it is up to each individual member to express what the legitimate objective is. Any issue under the sun. Protectionism is not likely to fly under the WTO as a legitimate objective. It's one that WTO is not about, in a sense, but protection of human health, national security, and animal welfare, some will say, some will not agree with, but these are all typical legitimate objectives. SPS is closed. So the SPS agreement, you can only have the objectives of protecting human life or plant, animal, and health. Those are the only objectives you can have under SPS, and that's what distinguishes an SPS measure from a TBT measure. It's the objective. There's no other way of discriminating or of finding the difference between TBT and SPS. So TBT open, therefore A would actually be maybe counterintuitively, but A would actually be the correct answer, but B is actually a wrong answer in this case. Okay.
And it is indeed a bit counterintuitive because Article 2.2 of the TBT Agreement, which is the one that contains this open list of legitimate policy objectives, includes every single objective that is found in B. So I think it was maybe a little cheeky on our side, but
with the word integrated.
Exactly. And I had never heard the argument that I just heard from Primat, which was very interesting, which is most likely, or in most scenarios, regulation will be covered by one of these objectives found in B, which mirrors what is in Article 2.2. But I guess once again, the point made by Erik is the key one. TBT is an open agreement. Our colleague here indicated the words inter alia, so maybe that's what would also make the correct answer be A.
Okay, go to the next sentence.
So we go to statement 6. Anyone maybe over there would like to read it?
The sixth point is regarding standards and public policy. A is standards can be effectively substituted for technical regulations and serve directly as of a tool of public policy. They usually represent the consensus of key stakeholders. B point is, by referring to the standards in regulations, regulators can tap into the expertise of standardization community for meeting legitimate objectives. In this manner, standards support regulation. In my opinion, the P point is correct because as the standards are made, they are by nature voluntary in nature. And regulators can use them while the implementation of orders, quality control orders. So I think these are correct.
Thank you. Are there any other views? Would somebody think that A is the correct statement? Seems to be more consensus on this one.
Yeah. Either that or the room soon needs coffee. We're soon there.
Yeah, I think the points you made are exactly correct. Regulators can indeed tap into the expertise by referring to standards. And in this manner, indeed, standards can support regulation. So I think those 2 points in B are indeed correct and crucial. Now let's take a look at the other side of the coin. What would be the potential problems with statement A? So the one is this notion of standards can substitute for technical regulations and serve directly as a tool of public policy. They represent the consensus of key stakeholders. So I think maybe this is where the statement A goes a bit too far, right? Because indeed, in developing standards, the standardizing community agrees, maybe by consensus, on one way over the other. But is it true that it represents the consensus of all key stakeholders? Yeah, please.
Not necessarily till the time. Good morning, everybody. So I think there is a problem that maybe they represent the consensus of stakeholders, but they don't become regulation till the time they are made mandatory through the quality control orders. So standards are voluntary in nature. They may or may not be followed by the industry if they are not made mandatory.
Thank you, and I think that's a very good point, and we will get into that. But maybe even taking one step before that, I think it's important to note that when policymakers develop regulations, mandatory regulations, they are taking into consideration a wide range of issues into consideration. They are thinking about policy issues that may not necessarily be contemplated by the standardizing community in developing standards. So in that sense, it is difficult to say that standards would represent the consensus of all the key stakeholders, in particular policymakers. I think there was an intervention there.
So in some cases, they can, the member countries can also adopt higher standard if there is a scientific evidence to support. And also there is scientific uncertainty in some way.
Yeah, so
that way, B will be the right key.
Yeah, for me, the main point, or one of the, was Mateo was saying, I think the key issue with this one is the notion that standards support regulation. That's the main issue to take out of this. So standards do not substitute for regulation. The regulation is a decision taken by government. They can do it through regulation, an act, a decree, call it what you want. In many countries, but it's an act by government that makes a certain requirement mandatory. And that requirement may be in a standard, and it should be in a standard. If work is done by standards bodies, that serves to help governments develop the right kind of regulation. And often that standard may exist in an international standard, which will make sure that you have probably less and not an unnecessary effect on trade later. But I think by the lady, as you were saying down there, it's very important to understand this distinction between a standard and a regulation, because the way the WTO rules bite are different. A standard is voluntary, and you don't have to notify it necessarily, and because it's voluntary, it tends to attract less attention at the WTO. But if it becomes mandatory through whatever act of government, you mentioned Quality Control Act, or if any kind of act makes those requirements mandatory through the eyes of the WTO, that is now a technical regulation, which should be notified, which may be challenged, etc. So that distinction, and it's done differently in every country, and there is flexibility to do it in the way you think is most appropriate in your country, but it is that hand of government that's very important with respect to the TBT agreement.
I think even though I have a kind of clarity in my mind, but perhaps it would help, other than the difference between standards and regulations, if one looks at what is the end objectives one meets by adopting standards, by conforming to regulations. So when we look through that lens, perhaps it becomes more clear. What I'm trying to say here is standards, agreed standards, if you want to take an automobile, for example, it can be a high standard car, a luxurious car. It depends on what standards are there. It's a high standard car. But does it actually provide comfort to the authorities that it is safe? The state steps in and authorizes, brings in a regulation where it feels a particular automobile is safe to drive off the road for the passenger and for the people around, which is not necessarily achieved to standards. It could be a very high standard car, but is it actually performing to the requirement? So that's another way of looking at standards and regulations. Standards don't necessarily achieve the objective which the state is trying to pursue.
Excuse me, yeah. So this is quite a complex area, and I think we are touching on it now, but we will come back to it because it's essentially actually right after the coffee break. But this issue of what is the standards for, and at what point should governments regulate, is quite significant. You spoke about cars, but you can the computer you're using there. A typical standard under the IEC international standards will make sure that when you plug in the computer, no one is electrocuted. That's a safety issue, and it may be mandatory because government steps in to make sure that electrical equipment are safe, whether it's toasters or computers. That is often based on an international standard, but it has been put into law through regulation. But there will be hundreds of other standards. So there can be standards about energy efficiency, and I think I see one of the labels, or for instance, the Energy Star. That doesn't have to be mandatory. That can be a standard that is used to market the computer. Or if it's about wood, it could be about the sustainability of the wood that is sourced. So IKEA, it's a big Swedish furniture company. It only puts wood in its stores that have the FSC certification, Forest Stewardship Council. That's not regulated. There's no government action there. But IKEA, as a big seller of wood, has decided to do that as a way of profiling its product, to show that it's environmental friendly. But it's not a regulation. You can't challenge that at the WTO. Do I make this distinction clear? There's one question here.
So my question is that what is the exact difference between standards and regulations, and not being able to get the distinction between the two?
I suggest we park that question if you want, because we have a slide where we look at exactly this that will come right after the coffee, and then we can get back into this discussion, because it's an important one and we should take the time. Is that okay? We'll come back to this issue? Fine? Or was it another different question?
Overall, standards is the best one because standards are not followed, are not practiced, only the regulation comes into effect. For example, a standard is set in codes or it's followed by member countries uniformly, it is only by regulation. It is not followed by the stakeholders when it comes to regulation. And regulation is a measure which has also the monitoring of the regulation. Regulation has come, it has to be monitored. And that's possible. Everything is so standard. Standard is the best thing. Everybody follows that. That's right.
Thank you. I simply just to close, because I think maybe we need to move to the next statement. This is such an important discussion, and when we get to that slide that Erik mentioned, we will in particular delve into the meanings of regulation and standard for purposes of the TBT agreement, because these terms are regularly used on common parlance, and they change from country to country, but in the WTO agreement they have very specific meanings, and there is a very clear distinction between the two. So we will get to that. Should we go to standard 7, statement 7? Coffee is needed, certainly. Which table should we go? Here? Would somebody here like to read statement 7?
Statement E. Even if not required, private standards should strive to be developed in line with the TBT Agreement's Code of Good Practice and TBT Committee's 6 principles. Statement B. Only standards developed by organizations comprised of national member bodies can be considered as international standards under the TBT Agreement. I would like to go with Statement A as the Article 5 of the TBT Agreement suggests that the Code of Good Practices shall ensure by the governments and non-government bodies in the country.
Yeah, I suggest you're right on that one. I suggest we move quickly on this. B is wrong because there is nothing that kind of excludes anybody from being a status body of the TBT agreement. Yes, you can look at the principles. If it's a closed body, if it doesn't accept other countries to become members, it's more less likely to be so. But actually, under the TBT agreement, almost anybody can be a standards body. Whether it's then considered relevant or not for members, it's a different issue. So even private standardizing bodies that set certification standards, sustainability, organic standards, they can be considered international if a government chooses to use them. In that sense, also the TBT agreement is open. Again, SBS is closed, TBT is open. SBS is closed because you only have 3 international standardizing bodies mentioned in the text of the agreement itself. Codex, OIE, IPPC, they're actually in the text of the agreement. While the TBT agreement has it completely open. It talks about relevant international standardizing bodies. Are you okay with that? NGOs. NGOs. Let's move to number 8. Would you like to read this one?
This is regarding transparency. Statement A. Members must notify draft technical regulations, standards and conformity assessment procedures. Statement B. Members are encouraged to notify the final adopted text of technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures. I will go with A basically in all the standards that we are notifying, that is to be notified basically indicated from WTO, it should be notified by another.
Thank you. Is there another view on this? Would somebody rather go with B? As you think about it, so let's take it maybe step by step. So the TBT agreement covers 3 types of measures: technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures. Period. That's it. 1, 2, 3. And those are the 3 mentioned in statement A. Now the question, and we will go into this in a lot more detail, but of course, one of the central pillars of the TBT agreement is transparency and all the transparency disciplines that it imposes. And one of these key transparency disciplines requires members to notify some TBT measures. Now the question is it all of them or just a few? And maybe, any views on this? Is there, among the 3 measures in statement A, is there one of these that does not need to be notified to the WTO? Standards, correct. So the notification obligations that apply to draft measures only apply to technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures. We will go into this in detail, but basically the TBT agreement is unique, only compared, maybe only with the SPS agreement, in that it requires members to notify draft technical regulations and draft conformity assessment procedures. In other words, before they enter into force. But when it comes to standards, there is a transparency obligation, but it's a little bit different because standards are voluntary and they are taken by other bodies rather than the government directly as acting as government. And therefore standards, the transparency obligation with respect to standards is basically one that is satisfied by abiding by the Code of Good Practice, and we will see that in more detail, that requires that standardizing bodies publish every 6 months their work program. And in that work program, they need to indicate which standards they have adopted in the last 6 months and which standards they are currently developing. So there is transparency with respect to standards, but it is not quite the same, and it is not as onerous as the transparency disciplines that apply to technical regulations and conformity assessment.
But if it's of any comfort to you, we were discussing this over breakfast and scratching our heads on which one was it. Because it's true, it looks, I would have automatically gone for A, but actually you don't have to notify standards. So it's only, as Mateo was saying, was technical regulations. And B is correct in that it's that there's a recommendation adopted by the committee where you should also notify adopted text, but it's a recommendation, it's not an obligation. Okay? So let's quickly move on.
But then if we understand that a member must notify all draft technical regulations, because I mean, the SHAPO has certain conditions in the text, right? No international standard, we have significant effects.
Yeah, we are
to that extent.
Yeah, we're simplifying for brevity, but in principle, the obligation is you need to notify all draft technical regulations. I think one should think of it that way. Then there are some exclusions. You don't have to notify those that are based on international standards. You don't have to notify those that don't have any significant effect on trade. But I would forget those exclusions because it causes too much head pain. Did it have an effect on trade or not? You don't know. Is there a relevant international standard? I don't know. It's much better simply for the purposes of transparency, and it doesn't have any legal consequence to notify any draft measure that is technical regulation.
It is necessary to notify, but we don't see any final draft measure which has been re-notified of the draft after the committee in practice. Should we take the draft notification which is available at the WTO when a country notifies as a final measure if there is no change? So not re-notified.
So good point. So several members, more and more, are notifying the final adopted text as an addendum to the original notification. This is becoming more of a practice, and that's what E is all about here. And that, I think, is a very good practice, because it means that those who are interested can go and look directly at what the final one is. Otherwise, you need to use the original notification, go to the link, and find your way to the final text. So I would encourage the idea that one notifies the final version of the text. I have to apologize because I thought the coffee was 11:30, but I think it was 11. So I hope I'm not keeping you all. We're not keeping you all. Or is it 11? No, it's 11. Okay. Would you like to? Can we take the last two questions and break? Is that okay with you? I'm sorry, we will otherwise keep more strict. It's good because you're getting more.
We have 10 minutes more?
We have 10 minutes.
Oh, great.
The 9 o'clock. Good.
Okay, so, right.
Who wants to developing countries?
I have a question in statement.
If there is a question here.
Statement B is mentioned that members are encouraged to notify. The encouragement is not mandatory notifying.
Yeah, and it's actually great that we have 10 more minutes because I did want to go back to the comment from our lady here and to that point. So I think because of time, Erik was perhaps simply not going into the details. So there is what the obligations in Article, let's say 2.9 say with respect to notifications of draft technical regulations. And indeed, as you were rightly saying, there are some conditions, and the obligation is mostly about notifying draft measures. And then what Erik was mentioning was the practice that has been developed in the TBT community over the last 25 years, where members have actually taken those obligations further in the interest of the greater objective of transparency. So even though in the actual agreement you don't see an obligation to notify final measures, there is a recommendation from the TBT committee, which basically means from all WTO members, highly encouraging the notification of final measures. And what we're starting to see now is that more and more members are also notifying those final measures, which then allows regulators across the world to have a much better tracking of the evolution of policies.
This is the benefit of going on mission with a lawyer and an economist. So I talk about head pain, and he goes into the details of what you're actually supposed to do. But that's completely correct. Yeah. I think we have next one there.
Number 9. The TBT and SPS committees have a mandate to resolve specific trade concerns that are brought before their respective committees. B. Members use the TBT and SPS committees as a forum to review and discuss specific trade concerns regarding measures, and this has contributed to the resolution of some concerns. I think it's B.
Okay, and why?
I'm not aware of any mandate. The word mandate is key, I think, in statement A.
Very good, yeah.
Specific trade concerns in other members can also join the discussion. There is a specific trade concern. We support that.
Okay, so any other views on this one? No, you were right here because on the TBT and SPS, we don't have the committees don't have a mandate to solve the concerns. They are simply a forum where issues can be raised for discussion, and yes, many times they are solved, and sometimes we hear about them increasing in the committee. But it's not a forum for the resolution of trade problems. For that we have dispute settlement procedures, which are more formal, legal, or costly. The committee is more of a constructive forum, a discussion among peers. It's open, it's not closed. The atmosphere is bilateral in many ways, because when you come for a committee week, India or China will have bilateral discussions to try to resolve the issue. So B is correct in that sense. Okay.
Okay, so let's go to the last statement on developing countries. I don't know, maybe somebody over here. Well, actually, how about
this is question number 10. Developing countries. Technical regulation, statement A, technical regulation must not create obstacle to the expansion and diversification of export from developing country members. Statement B, when enacting technical regulation, member must take into account the special development, financial and trade needs of developing countries members.
Which of the two is the better statement in your view?
So, with respect to both the statements, there is a problem of must. So, I am not aware about the statement 1, which is technical regulation must not create obstacle. Rather, that is only for the special development, financial and trade developing countries. So statement B.
Interesting. Any other views? So maybe let's walk this through. So, you know, we've been discussing since the beginning how technical regulations can result in significant trade barriers, right? And when contracting parties to the GATT were negotiating the TBT agreement that was created in 1995 with the creation of the WTO, they were particularly worried about enjoying tariff reductions, but then being subject to trade barriers in the form of regulations. So the question is, where does the agreement come out in this regard? So statement A, as the colleague rightly pointed out, is perhaps a little too, it's too good to be true in a way. It's too ambitious because it in a way indicates that if there is exports from developing country members, there is no possibility whatsoever for technical regulations to create obstacles to that trade. So that's not exactly what the agreement stands for, but that doesn't mean that the agreement is oblivious to the needs of developing countries. There are a number of disciplines that are called special and differential treatment disciplines that recognize the special needs of developing countries, particularly when it comes to regulations, and therefore, pursuant to some of those disciplines, WTO members, and in particular in this case I guess developed members, when they are enacting technical regulations, they are required to take into account the special needs, financial and trade of developing countries. So that means that the agreement goes at least some way in recognizing that developing countries face special needs, and particularly when it comes to regulation. So often, you know, in the committee or even in the context of WTO litigation, developing country members that are taking issue with a regulation, they often refer to that obligation and they question in which ways have you taken into account our needs. I don't know if you would like to add something, Erik.
No, that's perfect. Okay, then I think we came to the break. I know what your impression is, Mateo, but my impression is that I think you have a very good knowledge in general, and I can see it from the interaction that there's a really good base among you here. So what we tried to do with this exercise was to bring out some of the key issues, you know, starting from the WTO in general, what we mean by trade liberalization, going to sustainability, some of the core issues, what the difference between standards, this issue of a balance in the agreement or not, the term necessity, which is central to the TBT agreement, and then a little bit about the developing country context, the role of the committee, but we have scraped on the surface. Yes, we have talked about some of the issues, but we will go deeper. So after the coffee, what I suggest, I mean, listening to you now, I think what we will start with is the issue of what do we mean by a measure. What is a TBT measure? Standard regulation performance assessment. I think that might be important to get across first and have that discussion, and then we will look about a little bit deeper into the principles. Okay, so I leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Big round of applause to all of you for the good knowledge.
That was indeed an interactive session.